Hello, KCD Israel. It is very nice indeed to be here. Thank you for the warm welcome. I am Andy from ControlPlane, and I will take you on a whistle-stop tour of where we have come from with Cloud Native and where the future may take us. So, I'm very proud to be involved with a lot of open source organizations. ControlPlane is a security consultancy. We focus on enabling the cloud and cloud native for regulated industries. Of course, the CNCF's Technical Advisory Group on Security looks to help assure the project that Laurie has just been describing to us and ensure the due diligence and technicality, ease of use, secure by default of the projects that escalate through that process. And Open UK is a charity trying to stop the UK government from blowing its own feet off with open source policy. I do my best in those regards. I wrote a book with my dear esteemed co-author, Mr. Michael Hasselblas. Hacking Kubernetes is available as a free half PDF download behind the email paywall. And without further ado, let's have a look at the history of Cloud Native. Where did we come from and where indeed are we going? So we started with mainframes through co-located servers and VMs opened up the cloud. So where did Cloud Native come from? We have Linux birthing LXC, the first container runtime. Google contemporaneously builds Borg, its distributed container manager. Containers, but not as we know them today. The Linux kernel ships its first virtual machine, KVM, the kernel virtual machine manager, which runs software virtualizations built upon the paradigms that Zen built out, and hence we had the first public cloud. AWS used Zen, and virtualization proliferated. We learned resilience and scaling lessons from running distributed systems on commodity infrastructure. And these inspired the patterns and practices that are enshrined within Cloud Native today. And from there, technology exploded. Docker, Kubernetes, the OCI, the Open Container Interface, and the birth of next-generation runtimes, mixing containers and VMs. So these are the foundational technologies that birthed the public cloud, Zen, QEMU, KVM, and brought us somebody else's computer. We took the lessons of scalability, elasticity, resilience to underlying machine failure, and distributed systems became commoditized. Containers arrive to split the kernel into individual buckets of compute and resource, and each container a microcosm of Linux running on its own shared compute. Containers don't exist. There is no structure representing a container in the kernel. They are the combination of many APIs. This is why Docker grew to success. It provided an easy-to-use, developer-friendly experience to abstract the deep complexity of Linux container implementations. But it didn't support cross-host networking, data sharing, service discovery, or any other differentiators that the good ship Kubernetes brought us. So we rocked on with Kubernetes for a while, until people started to question, have we lost some of the isolation primitives? Are containers better than VMs? They are a different proposition. Surely we could take the hardware-assisted virtualization and isolation of a virtual machine and the lightweight security barriers of a container and merge the two together. Welcome to the next generation of runtimes, micro VMs. And the container image formats remain compatible, containers on a stratospheric, rainbow-powered trajectory. Okay, so this isn't going to be a classic high-level talk. We're going to go really deep for the rest of this. We'll touch some of these technologies. We touch some of these on a daily basis, so you don't have to. And we'll talk about whether or not we think these things are in the short or the long term. I wrote about some of these at the beginning of the year. Writing predictions is very much like tossing a load of coins and just seeing which way they land. This is my best effort for the year. We'll see what happens at the end. Okay, so software abstractions require CPU time to execute. Virtualization is a balance of security and performance. So these next generation process isolation formats bring us some compromise, and where you sit on that spectrum relates to your risk tolerance, the amount of money you can spend on hardware, the maintainers and operators of the system. So, first of all, WebAssembly is now available as a plugin for Docker. Server-side WebAssembly tooling is starting to proliferate. This is a binary format for executable code that Run C now supports. It's already matured with in-browser virtualization and implementations. We're unlikely to see this really exploding. There's lightning talks about this later. For this year, there are some core file system API rewrites going on, but today you can use WASM as a compile target, push it into a container, and run it in your clusters. It reduces your attack surface, you don't bundle build time dependencies, and you don't ship a shell in your container. So if you do have a remotely exploitable vulnerability, a remote code execution, it's very difficult to exploit because you can't then attach a reverse shell or get command and control into the container. WebAssembly is a good thing. What about unikernels? Same kind of style, taking the API surface of a kernel and chopping out everything you don't need. It is a packaging post-build compilation step that makes it very difficult to debug in production, where WebAssembly has hooks to allow you to go and debug, and will actually generate a human-readable version of the code. Unikernels are traditionally difficult, so we still see lots of unikernel approaches, but generally they're very hard to debug, and the benefits we get from complete isolation also mean that we suffer slightly with observability and production time debugging. Kata containers. These are super nifty. This is a micro VM approach. What we're looking at is essentially a hypervisor. So this is a virtual machine manager that starts a virtual machine, and inside that VM, we then run a container. So it's nesting the different paradigms. If there is a vulnerability in one layer, it is enshrined and sort of helped by the other. This runs in Kubernetes. It is a nifty implementation. Where would this be most useful? Well, potentially when looking at isolating data, perhaps databases, but do we want to run a database in a container or a VM? Probably not. High input-output workloads mean that this is still being pushed to its limits, and it's not a strong recommend for data isolation at this point. Right, into platform engineering. Kubernetes is a platform, famously, and now we see that most of the platforms that have been built for managing our containers have been purchased by a cloud vendor or some distribution somewhere. We're kind of back to the beginning where we were years ago, where we all have to build our own platforms. Platforms represent the underlying infrastructure. Obviously, we started with mainframes. Kubernetes is arguably the cloud operating system platform. So from multi-tenanting into the cloud, when building these platforms, security should be a cross-cutting concern. As with Kubernetes, starts off written in Golang. Very few security people knew Golang back in 2013, 14, 15, maybe, he says, struggling to remember. And so we saw Kubernetes not necessarily secure by default with a lot of decisions. No default network policy, pod security policy or standards not enforced by default. These things make sense to attract developers onto the platform. We saw it was the correct decision because we now have the second most popular project on GitHub is Kubernetes. But it comes at some cost of security because security people had to catch up, learn Golang, understand a different type of sort of memory safe, but also parallelized, sort of thread managed programming language. What's the point here? We're kind of at risk of doing this again. Developers love to build things. Platforms should have security intertwined. We're talking secure by default design. We're talking guardrails and CI/CD. We're talking shift left from an application code perspective, but also from an admission control perspective. If we apply a static analysis to our pod manifests when they hit the cluster, or we've got an open gatekeeper admission controller, for example, just push that policy left. Give it to your developers, allow them to run it on their local machines, and help that platform to exist on the user's machine so that they don't get surprised by security saying no at runtime. Nothing really matters in terms of all these platforms if things are not reproducible. Supply chain security is one of my favorite things. I've been at this for a number of years. It is now proliferated. We saw 30,000 malicious packages uploaded to NPM last week. Insane. There is a huge preponderance of assault on the public registers, talking typo squatting, people trying to take over public dependencies. We saw an attack on one of the machine learning systems over Christmas, between Christmas and New Year. Arguably, they thought people were maybe on holiday. I think they should have waited for the first week of the year when everyone was hungover. So the point is, reproducible builds give us some safety when dealing with supply chain attacks. How does that work? Well, first of all, we must have deterministic builds. That means there is nothing based on anything to do with time, so you're not putting timestamps in your outputs. It means that you use the same sorting everywhere. That might mean setting your locale the same, for example. And then you can run the same build at 2 different times, 2 places around the world, and cryptographically hash. Just run a hashing function on the sum of the outputs. That gives you a hash, a single identifier for the whole build. If you can deterministically do that, and you can say, well, those 2 hashes are the same, then we defeat the original old school supply chain attack, Reflections on Trusting Trust, where, this is Ken Thompson's paper from 1984, I think. There's no date on there, but somewhere around there, whereby somebody attacks a compiler, and the compiler generates backdoored code. If it compiles itself, it maintains the backdoor. So the point is, if somebody attacks our build infrastructure in a SolarWinds style, and this is actually how SolarWinds was mitigated by that organization, we built the same thing on 2 isolated, geographically dispersed systems, and if one of them doesn't match the other one, we either have non-determinism or a lack of reproducibility in the build, or some form of supply chain attack. Obviously, if the dependency is attacked upstream and the same thing is pulled into 2 different places, we're in trouble. But this is the first goal of defending against supply chain insecurity. Without reproducible builds, things get very difficult. So, with reproducibility, we can then use the software factory pattern. This is to defeat the Snowflake-Jenkins problem, where you can't touch your build server. Everything is enshrined into millions of lines of bash. Now, I love bash. You should use the bash acceptance testing system if you do have any bash. But yes, nevertheless, we don't want that. We want a system that can build itself, that can build copies of itself, that can build its descendants. The software factory pattern allows an organization to recover from a data center that has become a smoldering hole in the ground, because you take your root of trust, a trusted compute base, a load of containers with the infrastructure as code you need to stand this up, and then you build something that might, in this day and age, look like Kubernetes with Tecton. Your mileage may vary, or you can just do it with a load of containers, reconfigure a hosted build service of whatever type you use. The point is, reproducibility for your build infrastructure is something that will be, as we move forward, looked at as a signal of maturity for an organization. Looking at supply chain attacks, memory safety, CI/CD badges, and we will have a lot of talk about GitOps today. As we mutate our organizations to become more GitOps friendly, we start to share roles and responsibilities. The controls here have to be enforced on our version control system level. That is basically branch protection, code signing, ensuring that we run static analysis on our pull requests, contributor analysis to make sure, and there's all sorts of exploding geopolitical angles to that as well, but kind of keep a bit more local. Our organizations, like Conway's Law, must mutate to reflect the technology that we want to deliver. And this all sounds like a lot of complexity. There is not infinite time nor money to achieve these things. Onboarding new colleagues into this world of ever-increasing complexity must be top of mind in order to build a system or an organization that has longevity, that's able to perpetuate into the future. But in the meantime, these are not the colleagues that we're looking for, but it's worth discussing because, again, these things are storming into our systems as we stand. So let's start with cryptography. There's a lot of talk about quantum cryptography breaking everything. Realistically, if we have stuff that's encrypted today and it's captured and hived off somewhere, it will be broken in the next 20 years or so. That's how things have always worked. Cryptography has a window of utility, and then you have to upgrade your key length or however it looks for you. TLS 1.3 supports a cipher cartridge almost. So while we had ciphers that were linked to the spec for previous iterations, TLS 1.3 allows us to mutate and use new novel ciphers as cryptography advances. So we've seen Cloudflare and Google running some wide internet scale tests of post-quantum cryptography. We should be okay, as long as we stay without using middleware interceptor boxes and keeping our browsers updated. This shouldn't be too much of a problem for us at this point. However, AI is undoubtedly coming for your breakfast. How long will it be? Well, we can look at DeepMind to get an idea. The way these things tend to go is relatively exponential. DeepMind went from sort of automating some computer games to beating the game of Go, which is a matter of such huge complexity that the problem space is unbrute forceable with current hardware. So they definitely did something of a unique and novel style. The question then, how fast, where are we on the AI curve? Well, we're still probably at the bottom trending upwards. There is certainly potential for offensive AI where a machine, a large language model, is able to, in the most catastrophic sense, chain together and generate novel payloads to form attack chains or kill chains that humans have not yet implemented or comprehended. It's a nightmarish scenario. The DARPA 2016 Cyber Grand Challenge had machines doing this for binary exploitation. At the point somebody wires up ChatGPT 5, perhaps, to a terminal and lets it loose, we should probably try and make sure we have at least some automated remediation to protect against it. This then becomes a generative adversarial AI on AI that we can watch as Skynet slowly takes us all over. So in the meantime, government interventionism. There is plenty of action coming in from the Biden administration. The European Union has the Cyber Resilience Act. Bits of this legislation have really risked putting open source developers on the hook for things that no warranty, implied or guaranteed, really should obviate. So we've seen CVEs explode. Whether this is due to greater scrutiny or more software or more vulnerability remains to be seen. But the point is, the way that these are dealt with are now a matter of legislation. The cost of a breach is increasing year on year. Ransomware, of course, causing us all horrendous trouble. So what the US administration have done is said, we know how to do this with aircraft carriers, military hardware, pharmaceuticals. Let's use a bill of materials. There we go, the software bill of materials. This is like a recipe for software. And when is it useful? Well, open source software contains the seeds of its own revolution. It's open, you can read and build the whole thing. An SBOM distributed alongside an open source package, what's the point? It's kind of someone saying, there's no need to do a scan on this, there's no need to perform software composition analysis, just trust me on this. In my mind, that is lunacy, and we should always be scanning and verifying SBOMs that come with open source software, because otherwise, we're just allowing someone to bypass our internal process from external to the organization. If somebody manipulates that SBOM, we have no way of verifying that, because we trust the package to some level of trust. Closed source software is a very different proposition. We already have established a vendor relationship and a trust relationship with the vendor. We can't introspect into closed source code. So SBOMs are useful. Along with SBOMs, when vulnerabilities exist, we have this new software document called Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange Format, or VEX for short. And VEX tells us, for a vulnerability, if I have a closed source piece of software and I have log4j somewhere in the dependency tree, is it exploitable? Has it been configured, if it's an exploitable version, has it been configured in a certain way? For example, is JNLP actually available? Does the function or the method signature that is vulnerable exist, or did we excise that from the code base? In open source software, of course, you can just not ship that. You could vendor the piece of code and then not ship that particular bit of vulnerability. This is super useful. The only problem, again, is it is all down to trust, and we have to trust the person or the organization that ships this to us unless we want to allow someone to bypass our internal process. Workload identity, this is one of my favorite things. This is the properties of a process. As a Kubernetes workload, Spiffy and Spire provide what is essentially an attester. It observes the process and then generates a spiffy verifiable identity document, which you can turn into a JOT or an X509. This gives you TLS identity for mutual trust and is the way that Istio should work. It has a very naive implementation. This is part of the zero trust mandates the US government will also put out. So as we whiz into the final section, Linux and the kernel, Rust is turning up everywhere. We now have the right macros and the right interfaces to ship Rust into the kernel, which is super cool. eBPF, all new security tools are existing with this asynchronous Berkeley packet filter. But because of its asynchronicity, using it to block system calls is not always safe. What we want is this eBPF LSM, which does things synchronously. Confidential computing is micro VMs on steroids. It's defending against a malicious root user. Compute over data is the way of managing massive data at scale and operating on it individually. This is one of my friend's products from IPFS. And this is all incredibly complex. We really need to focus on making things accessible for new entrants into this community because there's no such thing as secure software and constantly iterating is key. We will be performing live threat modeling at KubeCon. If you turn up in Amsterdam and have a sticky situation or a difficult security problem, ControlPlane is here to give you half an hour of our time to try and make it a little bit more accessible or useful in some way. And thank you very much for your attention.